who, full of the ancient illusion that somewhere something can regularly be had for nothing, imagined that Wason's bacon and cheese were cheap because he sold preserved pineapple at a penny less than anybody else in the town. And she despised the roaring, vulgar success of advertising and electricity. She had in her some tincture of the old 19th century, which loved the decency of small, quiet things, and in the prim sanity of her judgment upon Wason she forgot for a few instants that she was in a dream, and that the streets and the whole town appeared strange and troubling to her, and that she scarcely knew what she was doing, and that the most seductive and enchanting of created men was at her side, and very content to be at her side, and also the voice within her was hushed. She said, "I don't see the fun of having the clothes torn off my back to save a penny. I think I shall go to Malkin's. I'll get some cocoa there too. Mrs. Tams simply lives for cocoa." And Louis archly answered, "I've always wondered what Mrs. Tams reminds me of. Now I know. She's exactly like a cocoa tin dented in the middle." She laughed with pleasure, not because she considered the remark in the least witty, but because it was so characteristic of Louis Fores. She wished humbly that she could say things just like that, and with caution she glanced up at him. They went into Ted Malkin's sober shop, where there was a nice handful of customers, in despite of Wason only 5 doors away. And no sooner had Rachel got inside than she was in the dream again, and the voice resumed its monotonous phrase, and she blushed. The swift change took her by surprise and frightened her. She was not in Bursley, but in some forbidden city without a name, pursuing some adventure at once shameful and delicious. A distinct fear seized her. Her self-consciousness was intense. And there was young Ted Malkin in his starched white shirt-sleeves and white apron and black waistcoat and tie, among his cheeses and flitches, every one of which he had personally selected and judged, weighing a piece of cheddar in his honourable copper and brass scales. He was attending to 2 little girls. He nodded with calm benevolence to Rachel and then to Louis Fores. It is true that he lifted his eyebrows, a habit of his, at sight of Fores, but he did so in a quite simple, friendly, and justifiable manner, with no insinuations. "In one moment, Miss Fleckring," said he. And as he rapidly tied up the parcel of cheese and snapped off the stout string with a skilled jerk of the hand, he demanded calmly, "How's Mrs. Maldon to-night?" "Much better," said Rachel, "thank you." And Louis Fores joined easily in, "You may say very much better." "That's rare good news, said Malkin. "I heard you had an anxious night of it. Go across and pay at the other counter, my dears." Then he called out loudly, "1 and 7, please." The little girls tripped importantly away. Yes, indeed, Rachel agreed. The tale of the illness, then, was spread over the town. She was glad, and her self-consciousness somehow decreased. She now fully understood the wisdom of Mrs. Maldon in refusing to let the police be informed of the disappearance of the money. What a fever in the shops of Bursley, even in the quiet shop of Ted Malkin, if the full story got abroad. "And what is it to be to-night, Miss Fleckring? These aren't quite your hours, are they? But I suppose you've been very upset." "Oh," said Rachel, "I only want a large tin of Singapore delicious chunks, please." But if she had announced her intention of spending £1,000 in Ted Malkin's shop, she would not have better pleased him. He beamed. He desired the whole shop to hear that order, for it was the vindication of honest, modest trading, of his father's methods and his own. His father himself, and about a couple of other tradesmen, had steadily fought the fight of the market-place against St. Luke's Square in the day of its glory, and more recently against the powerfully magnetic large shops at Hanbridge, and they had not been defeated. As for Ted Malkin, he was now beyond doubt the best provision dealer and grocer in the town, and had drawn ahead even of Holl's, as it was still called, the one good historic shop left in Luke's Square. The onslaught of Wason had alarmed him, though he had pretended to ignore it, but he was delectably reassured by this heavenly incident of the representative of one of his most distinguished customers coming into the shop and deliberately choosing to buy preserved pineapple from him at 8½d, when it could be got 30 yards away for 7½d. Rachel read his thoughts plainly. She knew well enough that she had done rather a fine thing, and her demeanour showed it. Ted Malkin enveloped the tin in suitable paper. "Sure there's nothing else?" "Not at this counter." He gave her the tin, smiled, and as he turned to the next waiting customer, called out, "Singapore delicious, 8½d." It was rather a poor affair, that tin, a declension from the great days of Mrs. Maldon's married life, when she spent freely, knowing naught of her husband's income except that it was large and elastic. In those days she would buy a real pineapple, entire, once every 3 weeks or so, costing 5, 6, 7, or 8 shillings, gorgeous and spectacular fruit. Now she might have pineapple every day if she chose, but it was not quite the same pineapple. She affected to like it, she did like it, but the difference between the old pineapple and the new was the saddening difference, for Mrs. Maldon's secret heart, between the great days and the paltry, facile convenience of the 20th century. It was to his aunt, who presided over the opposite side of the shop, including the cash desk, that Ted Malkin proclaimed in a loud voice the amounts of purchases on his own side. Miss Malkin was a virgin of 58 years, standing with definite and unchangeable ideas on every subject on earth or in heaven except her own age. As Rachel, followed by Louis Fores, crossed the shop, Miss Malkin looked at them and closed her lips and lowered her eyelids, and the upper part of her body seemed to curve slightly, with the sinuosity of a serpent, a strange, significant movement, sometimes ill described as bridling. The total effect was as though Miss Malkin had suddenly clicked the shutters down on all the windows of her soul, and was spying at Rachel and Louis Fores through a tiny concealed orifice in the region of her eye. It was nothing to Miss Malkin that Rachel, on that night of all nights, had come in to buy Singapore delicious chunks at 8.5d. It was nothing to her that Mrs. Maldon had had an attack. Miss Malkin merely saw Rachel and Fores gadding about the town together of a Saturday night while Mrs. Maldon was ill in bed, and she regarded Ted's benevolence as the benevolence of a simpleton. Between Miss Malkin's taciturnity and the voice within her, Rachel had a terrible 3 minutes. She was sneaped, which fortunately made her red hair angry, so that she could keep some of her dignity. Louis Fores seemed to be quite unconscious that a fearful scene was enacting between Miss Malkin and Rachel, and he blandly insisted on taking the pineapple tin and the cocoa tin and slipping them into the reticule, as though he had been shopping with Rachel all his life, and there was a perfect understanding between them. The moral effect was very bad. Rachel blushed again. When she emerged from the shop she had the illusion of being breathless, and in the midst of a terrific adventure the end of which none could foresee. She was furious against Miss Malkin and against herself, yet she indignantly justified herself. Was not Louis Fores Mrs. Maldon's nephew, and were not he and she doing the best thing they could together under the difficult circumstances of the old lady's illness? If she was not to co-operate with the old lady's sole relative in Bursley, with whom was she to co-operate? In vain such justifications. She murderously hated Miss Malkin. She said to herself, without meaning it, that no power should induce her ever to enter the shop again. And she thought, I can't possibly go into another shop to-night. I can't possibly do it. And yet I must. Why am I such a silly baby? As they walked slowly along the pavement she was in the wild dream anew, and Louis Fores was her only hope and reliance. She clung to him, though not with her arm. She seemed to know him very intimately, and still he was more enigmatic to her than ever he had been. As for Louis, beneath his tranquil mien of a man of experience and infinite tact, he was undergoing the most extraordinary and delightful sensations, keener even than those which had thrilled him in Rachel's kitchen on the previous evening. The social snob in him had somehow suddenly expired, and he felt intensely the strange charm of going shopping of a Saturday night with a young woman, and making a little purchase here and a little purchase there, and thinking about halfpennies. And in his fancy he built a small house to which he and Rachel would shortly return, and all the brilliant diversions of bachelordom seemed tame and tedious compared to the wondrous existence of this small house. "Now I have to go to Heath's the butcher's," said Rachel, determined at all costs to be a woman and not a silly baby. After that plain announcement her cowardice would have no chance to invent an excuse for not going into another shop, but she added, "And that'll be all." "I know Master Bob Heath. Known him a long time," said Louis Fores, with amusement in his voice, as though to imply that he could relate strange and titillating matters about Heath if he chose, and indeed that he was a mine of secret lore concerning the citizens. The fact was that he had travelled once to war races with the talkative Heath, and that Heath had introduced him to his brother Stanny Heath, a local bookmaker of some reputation, from whom Louis had won £5.10 during the felicitous day. Ever afterwards Bob Heath had effusively saluted Louis on every possible occasion, and had indeed once stopped him in the street and said, "My brother treated you all right, didn't he? Stanny's a true sport." And Louis had to be effusive also. It would never do to be cold to a man from whose brother you had won and received £5.10 on a racecourse. So that when Louis followed Rachel into Heath's shop at the top of Duck Bank, the fat and happy Heath gave him a greeting in which astonishment and warm regard were mingled. The shop was empty of customers, and also it contained little meat, for Heath's was not exactly a Saturday night trade. Bob Heath, clothed from head to foot in slightly blood-stained white, stood behind one hacked counter, and Mrs. Heath, similarly attired, and rather stouter, stood behind the other, and each possessed a long steel which hung from an ample loose girdle. Heath, a man of 40, had a salute somewhat military in gesture, though conceived in a softer, more accommodating spirit. He raised his chubby hand to his forehead, but all the muscles of it were lax, and the fingers loosely curved. At the same time he drew back his left foot and kicked up the heel a few inches. Louis amiably responded. Rachel went direct to Mrs. Heath, a woman of 45. She had never before seen Heath in the shop. "Doing much with the G's lately, Mr. Fores?" Heath inquired in a cheerful, discreet tone. "Not me." "Well, I can't say I've had much luck myself, sir." The conversation was begun in proper form. Through it Louis could hear Rachel buying a cutlet, and then another cutlet from Mrs. Heath, and protesting that 5d. was a good price, and all she desired to pay even for the finest cutlet in the shop. And then Rachel asked about sweetbreads. Heath's voice